This is McLeod Insights, where we feature conversations with longtime transportation industry veterans who are now team members at McLeod Software. Our goal is to support and empower our customers by helping them learn about proven ideas and best practices that will have a positive impact on how they run their companies. Let's dive in.
Hello and welcome to McLeod Insights. My guest today is Criss Wilson, data scientist here at McLeod Software. Our conversation today is going to be around the art of negotiation. Welcome, Criss.
Thank you, Robert. Glad to be here.
Criss and I were talking about the rhythm of freight and how rate analytics tools can help identify trends in the market. We got to a point where we're talking about how effective are you pricing your freight, and there's an art to negotiation. And Criss and I are going to continue the conversation today with the art of negotiation. So Criss, we were talking about rates, and do you believe, I think at this point we were referencing the past couple of years being COVID and coming out of what everybody kept referencing as a new normal, going back to a normal. And I think that we are slowly moving back to a normal. But when pricing freight, I think you're going to have to rely on either experience or information. And what's your choice?
Yeah, you can't certainly use the last 2 years as a benchmark to anything, because the last 2 years were unprecedented in human history. In terms of the magnitude of the people, the volume of people. I mean, we've had the Spanish flu and other pandemics, and people died, and maybe the percentages of the population that died were certainly higher, but the volume, the number of people that died weren't. And the magnitude of the impact and disruption that COVID caused is just in modern history not comparable to anything. And so we're going to take the last 2 years of pricing information and put it on a shelf and say, boy, I'm glad we're not doing that anymore. But that said, the freight rates in the United States, they move in a cycle. And the cycle, they repeat themselves, right? And that cycle is on the order of every 4 to 5 years. And so we are now entering a new freight cycle, and that cycle is going to be more predictable than the last 2 years. And so when it comes to understanding where we are in this cycle relative to what was going on in all the other cycles like where we are today, you're going to need vast amounts of data, historical data in this instance, because you basically have a 2-year window where that data is just off the charts hot and not comparable. And so you're going to have to reach back to 2019, 2018, 2017, in some cases maybe even 16 or 15. The idea being we can learn about market forces and we can predict what direction the market's going to go when we understand what the conditions of the market were. And if we can then understand those conditions and look back to history to find out when did we last realize these types of conditions and what was the outcome, we can use that. And that's not something a human being can do really well, really fast. And that's where computers come into play, because they think at the speed of light and they can retain a ridiculous amount of information. And that's where data science practices its trade. It's extracting the value from historical information, from conditions that are occurring in real time, and using those and modeling those mathematically to predict a future rate. Say, what's the rate tomorrow? What's the rate next week? What could the rate be next month or next year? And I say what could because the farther out in time we go into the future, the lower quality in terms of accuracy our prediction is. And that's true of anybody predicting the future. And so why do we do it? Well, we do that because we can think about different scenarios, and we can be proactive, not reactive, based on scenario planning. Well, if this happens, we're going to use this plan. If that happens, we're going to use this other plan. And so we can think about it largely in broad brush strokes, and we can change up the scenarios and see how our results change. So prediction has its value, even though it's an incomplete prediction the farther out in time you go.
Yeah, I don't think, like you said, I don't think that we can just go back and look at last month's, last quarter, last year's rate and be able to price things effectively. And then once you understand your pricing, be able to negotiate that price. So I think we have to go further back, and it makes it much more difficult for those people who are just coming into the trucking industry.
Extremely difficult.
Yeah. So the newer people that have tools available to give them current pricing still don't understand how to negotiate. So what I'd like to do is I want to throw out a few points to you, and maybe you can talk how you see these points in reference to those newer employees. So one thing that the main thing, I think you have to understand your operational cost.
That's number one. That's blocking and tackling. That's what the score is in your company, right? If you're not covering your costs, you're not going to be a company for very long, and that's just the way the world works. So for a trucking standpoint, we want to understand what is our hourly cost to run that truck, because if that truck is standing still, we're incurring that cost hourly. If that truck is moving, we're offsetting that cost hourly. The rub is we have to offset the entirety of that truck's cost for a day for that truck in the few hours that we're running. And so if you don't have a good grasp of what those costs are and how they're impacting your operation, you're at risk of not covering them. On the broker 3PL side, we transition away from an hourly cost over to a transactional cost. And that is, how much does it cost you on average to serve a transaction, to do that complete cycle? And so the target there is that transactional cost has to be, on average, no less than what your minimum return is, right? Because if that transactional cost is more than your minimum return on average, you're burning cash and you're in an unsustainable position to survive. You might live for a few months or quarters, but it's really difficult, and the banks will cut you off sooner rather than later because they're real good at predicting cash flow. That is their business.
Yeah, I think in certain instances, you can ship freight at a loss, but if you continue to do it, you won't be in business very long.
But not on average.
That's correct. All right, next one is, I've heard this, pay attention to your spot rates or the spot rates in that market.
Yeah. So pay attention to the spot rates, what they are. Those are that's the rate for unplanned truckloads shipments. And also pay attention to what percent of the market that they occupy. How many transactions on a given day moved that were spot or contract? That may not be easy information to get to now, but I can predict with great confidence that within a year or so, you'll have at least one source, because I know we're working on that at McLeod here. And there could be 2 or 3 sources, because I know my peers in the industry, data science peers, our friends over at DAT, our friends over at Internet Truck Stop, our friends at FreightWaves. They're really working hard to sift that, because that tells us a lot about how efficiently an economy is working or how efficiently a market is working. What was the percentage of shipments that traveled under a contract rate versus those that traveled under a spot rate?
Yeah, I think this is one industry where the technology providers really listen to their customers and try to provide them tools that will benefit them. One of the next ones is understanding the truck to load ratio in that area.
Yes. So this is a tricky one, and this is something that it takes some experience with, right? There will always be more loads than trucks, and there's a number of reasons for it, and I really don't want to get into the structure of it all. But DAT was one of the very first information brokers to provide the truck to load ratios state by state, and I used to download that every day, every week. I would look at it and study it, and how is it changing. We call equilibrium about 3 loads to every truck, plus or minus. And so that's an equilibrium state. And when you start to see more than 5 loads per truck, then that's an indicator that a particular market may be experiencing severe demand, right? Now, underlying that math, right? If you're using a load board to count the number of loads available in a market, the potential to double or triple count the same load exists. Because what will happen is, generally speaking, a shipper will broadcast the availability of a load to 3 or 4 or 5 trucking companies and brokers. And those brokers will post that load on the load board. So now 1 becomes 5. And the reality is there's only 1 there. And so load to truck ratios can be volatile, in that a single load that gets covered means 4 loads are just going to magically disappear from the market and the load boards. And so you have to understand that, and that's why we say 3 to 1 is basically equilibrium. That's one of the reasons, is because there is some duplication that occurs. And so I think, though, as we get more accurate, as we get more particular about the data that our systems generate, we'll be able to, in the future, identify a shipment so that it's not counted multiple times, because it's something that all of the data science departments at all those companies I've mentioned, we all struggle with it.
Yeah, I think the along that same lines, commodity becomes very important.
Critical. Commodity is one of those things that'll put you out of business if you're not careful. I can speak from my experience that our insurance carrier had a list of prohibited commodities, things that we couldn't haul because our insurance wouldn't cover it. And if we got caught hauling them, they would drop us, and as a result, we'd be uninsurable. And if you're uninsurable as a trucking company, you're not in business. That's the law. So you really do have to take care of that insurance relationship. It's critical to your ability to operate. And so there's risk and reward, right? If you're hauling copper, that's a valuable commodity, easy defense. You can take pure copper wire, cut it up, sell it as scrap, and make a lot of money for not a lot of effort in terms of stealing the truck. And so certain commodities are more risk prone to theft or to claims, right? Produce, frozen food, plasma products, right? You got to transport blood plasma at -5. And so if at any point during that transaction it was hotter than -5, the whole load is lost, and that's a lot of money. So there's just a higher risk. And if you're not certain about your commodities and you don't get it, right? You want to go slow when you start handling these exotic commodities, frozen meat, frozen fish, blood products. So I wouldn't discourage anyone from having multiple types of equipment, vans, reefer, and flatbeds, because different parts of the economy get hotter or colder in terms of demand at different times, and it's nice to have choices. But I would also caution that if you're going to get into handling frozen anything, start with refrigerated first.
Yeah.
Figure out the game and understand what the potential losses are, and then adjust your insurance and your expectations with your insurance broker accordingly.
Yeah, there's a big difference. In years past, it could have been chemicals. Hey, we're going to stay away from this area. But, I mean, there's a big difference today between paper goods and strawberries or medical products. So, yeah, you have to know your commodity, and your truck type's important. And I don't believe that you can properly negotiate or price freight without knowing that information.
That's absolutely true. So, I tell people negotiation is both an art and a science. The art comes in knowing what your shipper is willing to pay. And that is a function of what the price of that cargo is, what the cost of that cargo is to replace it. And then the science comes in the interaction between you and that shipper, or you and that driver, and the method that you use. And on the science side of it, there's a book called Just Listen. I recommend it every opportunity I get, so I'm going to do that here, by Mark Goulston. And Mark Mark is a unique character in that he taught the FBI how to negotiate hostage situations. So these are crisis situations. But negotiation in every instance is basically the cycle of persuasion. And so if you understand the cycle of persuasion, you can enroll the person that you're talking to. You get buy-in, and that's the first step in negotiation, is to get buy-in. And so the cycle of persuasion is pretty simple. You take somebody from listening to considering, from considering to willing to do, from willing to do to doing, and then from doing to glad they did it. And that is a whole complete cycle. And when you are sensitive to completing that cycle and not shortcutting it, you build relationships, and those relationships then serve you. You truly start to form partnerships. People come to trust you because they know you're not out to take advantage of them. You're looking for win-win. They're going to benefit, and you're going to benefit. And especially in the 3PL industry, when it comes to capacity, you want to have win-win relationships with all of your carriers, your asset providers. And from an asset provider's perspective, you want to have a win-win relationship with your shippers. What we learned in this last cycle that we can take away from it is that if you're not getting paid your fair value, fire the customer and find a better customer willing to pay you your fair value. In that regard, the market corrects itself. And people that want to take advantage of truckers are going to fall out of the market when the truckers stop allowing them to take advantage.
I would agree with that. And that goes into the next point, is consider the drop-off location or the market. Is that a consideration when you're pricing the freight to know where you're going and how do you get back?
Yeah, we're working on that. Tom McLeod is extremely interested in that. That whole order cycle, or that whole planning cycle, which is basically a week. So the idea is we plan a truck for a week, and the goal is to optimize the amount of margin or revenue, or margin and revenue, that truck earns. And so things like, is it a drop lot, right? Can I drop and hook? Those are things you want to give a little heavier weight to in terms of the planning and in terms of your customers. It's really nice to be able to show up, drop your trailer, and grab an empty and leave. That's a 20-minute transition, and you're off to your next shipment. Versus show up, wait in line, get your dock appointment, wait at the dock to be unloaded, finally get unloaded, and then get off the property. Difference entirely. One is 20 minutes, one is 2 hours or more, under the best case circumstances. So knowing your shipper is critical. Knowing their sophistication. Do they have yard operations? Yes or no? Can you spot trailers there? Yes or no? All of this works. And that is where contract pricing comes in, right? Because the high volume shippers, right? The highly sophisticated shippers, they're going to want contract rates. They don't want those contract rates to change. So if you're going to play that game, you got to play that game efficiently, right? To make sure you're earning a fair margin on the business you're doing.
That's true. And I think you kind of touched on one point. The load time is a factor. Whether it be a Monday load or a Friday load. And in the last scenario, you take out detention. If you've got a drop and hook location, hey, then detention is one thing you don't have to worry about.
That's right. Nobody wants to charge detention. They want to charge you a rate per mile for moving the load. That's what we do in trucking. You want to put a trucker in a state of chaos. Force that trucker to stay still for more than 2 or 3 hours. You will have a driver that is very anxious, very unsettled, because that driver finds their peace when they're on the road behind the wheel, moving somewhere from point A to point B. That's what we want our drivers to be, wired to move. So when you hold them at an origin or a destination beyond what is reasonable, you're wasting their time, and they're not getting paid for it. And that's when they become emotional. The other thing is we have a lot of rates that change in a market, and so I say know your spot market. you can look at markets and you can see that the rates on Monday are different from the rates on Saturday and Sunday. And that's true in virtually all markets, and different by an order of magnitude. The rates go up over the weekend. Well, why is that? Because there's scarcity in the market. We have electronic logging devices, which are hard to cheat on. And we have an hours of service law in the United States that says truckers can run 11 hours, I believe it still is. And then by state, it can be a little different. But nationally, if you're doing state-to-state moves, interstate moves, you can run 11 hours. And so that's their cycle, right? And they can work up to so many hours in a week, and then they have to do a 34-hour reset, right? And so that means they have to rest. And that's good for all of us that they have to rest. But it costs them money. So most of the cycles in the United States, the trade cycle, the commerce cycle, occurs Monday through Friday. And so truckers just naturally are going to rest Saturday and Sunday. Maybe want to get home, see the kids, hug the wife, mow the yard, whatever a normal person would do on the weekend. And so there's just fewer of them on the road, and that's why the price goes up. And if you don't understand what the price on Saturday and Sunday is, you're leaving money on the table, I promise you.
Yeah, that's true. Another factor is, and some of this may be hard to know or find out prior to pricing freight, but the other charges and the fees associated with it, certain permits or lumper charges needed, all the other charges, how do you handle those?
So those can be sensitive. They certainly compete for cash, and cash is king in a trucking company. So you're going to want to make sure you've got a tool and a team that accurately accounts for and documents the presence of these fees, especially lumpers. If you pay a lumper at a dock, you're going to get a receipt. You need that receipt as part of your document set when you submit your invoice. Maybe you don't have to submit those images, but if you were to get audited, you're going to need to produce those images. And so to prove that you paid those fees. And so there's no substitute for being for attention to detail from your accounting team. There's literally no substitute, because inattention to detail costs you money, and it's easy to measure. It's lost revenue. It's measured in the number of write-offs, the number of invoice corrections, and things of that nature. And oh, by the way, that's costing you money because you're paying somebody to negotiate. Okay, I'm going to reduce this invoice and resubmit it by N cents or N dollars because we didn't take care to attend to the details.
Yeah, I think that one of the key points also is part of this process is attempt to get a contract with it or be able to say no to a piece of freight.
Yeah, that's delicate, right? So brokers, they tend to live in the spot world, and shippers are going to tend to tell brokers that they don't have anything for them when they're covering their freight under contract. So brokers are going to need to penetrate the contract market. The last 2 years have been abnormal in every regard, and it's been good to live in the spot market because you got paid to do it. That freight doesn't exist anymore. It's now moving under contract in predictable times and predictable schedules at predictable rates. And so you're going to need to be a bit more competitive in the rate you offer, and you're going to have to really to do contract freight well as a broker. You've got to have relationships with asset providers, bit large and small, and you're going to need more than one provider. You got to cover your bases here. Not everybody's going to be in the right place at the right time, so you're going to have a plan B, a plan C, a plan D, and that's where things like digital freight matching really are handy, right? Because you can cover a lot of ground with your partner carriers quickly by using a digital freight matching tool, and that frees up your person to recruit more freight, because that's ultimately what we're doing, right?
Yeah, it gives you visibility to capacity that you're unaware of.
Yeah. And that's true for brokers, but it's also true for asset providers. I would say that the more you can automate your work, the more you create possibility for yourself, because those people can go out and find new opportunities for you.
Yeah, I think this question holds true in this. One of the questions that I like to ask my guest is, if you were new to the industry, which I know you've got quite a few years, if not decades in experience, if you were new to the industry and say 2 years or less, what advice would you give that person to help them move forward in the trucking industry?
Bone up on your rate analytics, because there's a whole world of experience that used to be that you had to sit in the chair and negotiate freight to learn what a truck was worth in a given market at a given time. And that education wasn't free. You were going to win big and you were going to lose big. And that's where the education comes in. Now you don't have to have such big wins or such big losses to know what the value of a truck is. What you do have to have is a source of information, a curated source of information. What is curated? Well, not all transactions can be used as much as we wish they could to negotiate or to calculate what that rate is going to be. And so curation is this whole act of measuring the integrity and the completeness of the data and judging it to be fit or unfit for the purpose of the analysis that you're doing. And so, there are people that have been doing it for years. DAT, Internet Truck Stops, have been around for more than a decade now. FreightWaves recently has joined the fray, and they've got a fantastic data science department headed up by Daniel Pickett. But that's not cheap, right? And so you're going to pay for this information. McLeod offers it in Impact. And it's not our primary business, but it is a byproduct of what our primary business, TMS software, is. It is the data that is spun off from those. And so we can give our customers an insight into the McLeod universe that they can use to judge their environment, to judge whether there's an opportunity to take rate or whether they have to give rate in order to keep some business. What percent of the market are they in the McLeod universe? Very difficult to calculate market share unless you've got an analytics partner that sees more of the market than you do. And so there are all these things that have to occur, but once they occur, then there are these tools that are available. And I would say that you invest in the tools that return you that money inside of a year. So what I would tell people who are paying for rate analytics is, what value is that rate analytic generating? So if there's a subscription rate for that rate analytic or that source of data, can you accurately measure the return on it? If you can't, you might be paying too much. If you can, then it doesn't matter what those rate analytics cost, because you're getting that value and then some, right? And so anytime I think about an investment, any investment, business or personal, I look at ROI, return on investment. When am I going to get back to break even for having spent that money? And a good rate analytics tool should get you to break even within the year, which is how you know you've got a good analytics tool. Because you can definitively say, but not for this information, I would have never known to increase my rate, to decrease my rate, to take this action or that action, to get into this market and out of that market. And so be candid with yourself, right? Because data science is not cheap. And if you want to do it on your own, it's going to be very expensive. If you want to share in it, which is why these companies exist, why McLeod exists, if you want to share in it, it's going to be less expensive, but it still has to return something to you. Having this information and not using it is a waste of money under any condition.
Yeah, that's a great answer. The tools are out there. use them, and you will have a return on investment very quickly. These tools didn't exist years ago, and everything was done manually with a crystal ball. And hopefully we can.
We're a little bit further ahead.
We've improved a little bit on that. So, Criss, thank you very much for your time today. Criss Wilson, again, is a data scientist here at McLeod Software. Thanks for listening to McLeod Insights.